This is a very, very basic discussion of the common good as it relates to the study of politics and the role of government and the role of individuals in government. And essentially, it's meant to say, well, what is it that is expected of citizens in terms of helping someone besides ourselves? So, the defining component of the common good, in other words, how we see it, really depends on our ideology, but it also depends on which strain of political thought we tend to embrace. Now, in the United States, which is a diverse country, we tend to have either classical or modern notions, but there are some classical non-Western and modern non-Western notions I'm probably not going to get to in this presentation. So I'm going to focus on the two dominant strains, the classical notion of the common good and the modern notion, because they tend to frame the basic debates about what our role is. The classical notion, and again, you should have gotten this from your Western Civ, and if you haven't, that means you haven't been conscious of it, not that it hasn't been taught. The classical notion of the world really revolves around a few basic sets of principles. And one of those principles is exactly what our definition of ourselves are. Can we be a whole human simply by focusing on our own concerns? And the classical notion to that says, no, you cannot do that. You actually are part of a larger whole, and so you must understand and behave in a manner that conforms to the promotion of the communal good, not simply your own interest. And that's why you're not supposed to behave in certain ways in the classical idea, and if you do, you get punished by the state because you have committed transgressions against the state. And that's actually why we have laws that say when you do certain behaviors, you violate not just principles of decency, not just crimes against another person, but crimes against the entire people of a particular jurisdiction. And that's why when someone is indicted of a crime, it's so-and-so versus the people of the state of Rhode Island or the state of Massachusetts or the state of Ohio or the state of Illinois. That's the classical notion that you're not just this individual actor, and we're not just a bunch of individual actors. The modern notion, which began with the Enlightenment and post-Renaissance period, the Renaissance is the transition, but Machiavelli and beyond, I would say, said, whoa, we're individual in our orientation, that the individual is important. Martin Luther, one of the reasons he broke from Catholic Church, even though he was training to be a priest, basically was this idea that an individual has the possibility of achieving their own salvation, and actually an obligation to achieve their own salvation, not simply by being obedient, but by being righteous and just. And so the individual can achieve salvation without having to go through the middle notions of saints and martyrs and priests and bishops and popes. So the individualistic notion comes both out of Reformation Christianity and out of modern political thought, beginning with Machiavelli, going through all sorts of people, including Hobbes and Locke, that no. We don't have to pursue collective action because the center of our universe is ourself. The civic notion in the modern idea is the belief that we have obligations only to what we would call self-interest. Now, that self-interest isn't simply what's good for me this instant, but what's good for me now, maybe in a week, maybe in a month, and what's good for the people I care about now, in a week, in a month, in a year, in 10 years. And so there can be this broader idea rather than this simple narcissistic notion of self, but it's really individualistic, and the idea that our obligations are tied really to our primary focus of our lives, ourselves, our family, maybe our community, and to what other affinity groups we may align. The individualistic notion of the common good, which is the dominant one in liberalism, is a very, very important element to liberalism in the sense that we do not have any kind of obligation to worry about those things we can't control in our own lives. And so For liberalism, this individualistic notion of the common good is foundational in the sense that we do not have to care about others, we can choose to care. So there's a choice. An important distinction in liberalism and this individualistic notion is that there's a distinction between our public behavior and our private behavior. And that public behavior are only those things that we do in order to promote our individual desires, our individual interests, our individual needs. It's not unconcerned with the idea of inequality, but inequality is not something that liberalism believes must be fully addressed. As long as you have political inequality, social inequality, legal inequality, that's all you need, and that you will have a common good being promoted through these rules and through these standards that everybody has, everybody follows. There's no collective way to eliminate injustice necessarily, or eliminate inequality in the eyes of a liberal, classical liberal that is, because that's something that achieves naturally as a result of the aggregation of all of our individual self-interested pursuits. But this distinction between public and private is very important. So I can engage my private life in a way that's completely irrelevant to my public life. And I get involved with public life only when I feel a need to engage and promote and enhance my private interests. So again, common good is achieved as a result of all of us going and being what I like to call greedy little devils, meaning pursuing our own interest and not worrying about whether it's going to help or hurt somebody, just making sure I don't actually literally hurt people with my actions. Collective notions of the common good are seen in modernity, and they tend to draw their justification from classical views of the world. Particularly Christianity and other religious belief systems. In the 19th century, we saw in the early 19th century the emergence of what is called Christian socialism. Best example of that is in France, when Philip Ozanam, back in the early to mid 1800s, founded the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which still exists today, that sort of embraces this notion that Christian men needed to band together to make the world more godlike and more just. It finds its roots in sort of the gospel, particularly the New Testament, and most specifically in the Acts of the Apostles, where after sort of Jesus left, and sometimes before he ascended into heaven, for those of you who are familiar with that, the apostles got together and they started engaging in collectivism. They gathered all their possessions together. They signed possessions over to the whole community. They worked together communally. That's the whole idea of communion in some ways. It's this idea that we share this thing together. And so in the 19th century, Roman Catholic and other Christians developed this idea of Christian socialism. A little bit later, kind of in the same general period, Marxism emerged as a materialistic understanding of society and how the common good is important there. In Marxism, of course, collective action is vital. And the reason it's vital is because the owners of the means of production are small in number, and their incentive, their obligation, their desire is to maximize their own profit. And to do that, they minimize the amount of sort of labor value that they pay to the workers, because, of course, excess labor value, meaning the difference in the value of something being produced and the amount that you actually paid the people who produce them, is what creates profit, which is a foundational component to capitalism. And so for Marx, of course, the common good was an important element of creating the socialist revolution. I'm not going to go any deeper into Marxism because it has such a small strain of tradition in the United States, or even North America, except for maybe Mexico. And so I'm not going to focus on that. Instead, I'm going to focus on some of the alternatives that were out there. Of course, Marx sort of shook Europe and it challenged the fundamental approach of laissez-faire capitalism that had led to, during the Industrial Revolution, lots of exploitation. And so, Marx was one competing answer. Remember, ideologies are not just descriptions and prescriptions, they're outlines for how to get to the good society. Marxism is one of them. Well, the other ideologies had to figure out, well, how are we going to counter this very strong strain of collectivism? And in liberalism, it led to what we call modern liberalism. T.H. Green in Great Britain developed the argument that the state is there to act as a counterweight to the corporatization of the economic world. The large corporation that exploits people can actually be softened through positive action of the state, through wage and hour laws, through safety conditions, through regulations that say you have to have certain quality in your meat. You can't have certain animals that are in your beef, like rats or mice or cockroaches or things like that. And then later through regulation of various sectors of the economy to soften the booms and busts of the macroeconomy, for example, or to create the television broadcasting industry as the U.S. government did in the early 1930s by regulating the airwaves and granting out exclusive licenses to bandwidths. So modern liberalism is one answer. And again, Christian responses occurred in the 19th century as well. And there are two main strains that are relevant to the United States. One, and I'm going to focus on this first because it's a Catholic school, and I think it's important that we sort of discuss what that means in non-theology courses, non-philosophy courses. In Catholic social thought, which began in the 1890s with the publication of the first papal encyclical entitled Rerum Novarum, which basically says workers have a right to unionize, because unionizing allows them to create a more just living situation for them and their families. And so the Pope actually said unions can have the right to organize, and the reason he did that was he wanted to say you don't have to become communists, which rejects religion, for atheism. You don't have to reject communism to be able to make your world better through collective action. You can see the elements of the need for collective good in Catholic tradition and Catholic doctrine in the Catechism. A similar parallel thought was going on in Protestantism in the form of what is called the social gospel. The idea that you aren't necessarily chosen by God to be saved the moment you are created, but instead you have to work to make the world more like the just world of heaven as a way of achieving your salvation. In other words, you have to make the world mimic what God is telling us we have to do. This is called the social gospel. That basically you look at what Jesus did. He fed the poor. He accompanied the sick. He cured the blind. He focused on children. He didn't ostracize tax collectors. He embraced tax collectors. This whole idea that if we make the world more like the world that Jesus promoted led to the promotion of the social gospel. And you can see the social gospel manifested in a lot of evangelicals, even though these days they tend to be more conservative. But it calls for an activist belief in faith as the main driver to creating God's just world here on earth now. Industrialization also created in sort of liberal political systems that were also capitalist, which is much of the Western world and much of Asia even. Basically, the rise of these large multinational corporations led to what some believe is a natural consequence of capitalism, and that is if you have large multinational corporations, you're going to have some kind of collective action in response to it. In other words, you have to have equilibrium, and if small numbers of companies become too powerful, you have to have a counterweight. And that counterweight can be unions, it could also be government. So collective notions of the common good come through both political and religious views of the social world, but also through the practice of capitalism. Unions emerged as a natural consequence of the creation of global capitalism in the 1890s. I think I've covered the role of faith in the United States. I just want to make sure that you understand that the social gospel of Protestantism, 19th and early 20th century Catholic social teaching, which began in the 1890s and continues today through various papal encyclicals, a movement in mid-20th century called Christian realism. These are three major strains in the United States that call for us as being engaged in the social world to make it more just. So religious motivation is a very important component to acting in terms of the common good, both in a progressive way and in a conservative way. Key similarities of the faith-driven motives. Number one, as a counter argument to traditional liberalism, the idea that you cannot ignore inequality and injustice because you have a mandate not to do so. The other is that there is some right to organize to improve conditions, in the Catholic sense, workers, and then later to improve the moral conditions. And then the third aspect of this sort of role of faith in promoting the common good is that government has a positive role in protecting and promoting justice, not just economic justice, but also social justice. And that could mean civil rights, but it could also mean sort of moral certainty. So basic summary. The individualistic notion of the common good, which is the strongest notion of the common good in the United States and other Anglo systems like Great Britain, like Canada, and Northern Ireland, and New Zealand and Australia, and some other places. Liberalism presumes that individuals are private. And so the key component to the common good is making sure that you set up a system where everybody has the same political power. Political equality, it's called. And that's often expressed through the franchise. Everybody should have the right to vote. But it's also through the selection of representatives who do the heavy lifting. And we do that through elections, and these elections have to be competitive, meaning there has to be serious alternatives presented and alternative choices for voters to make. The choices have to be pretty clear and known to the voters, and there has to be information out there presented by those running the elections, those campaigning for the elections, those covering the elections, that allows each individual to make a very clear self-interested choice. So the idea in this individualistic notion is that there will be laws that promote the common good. You protect the rules, particularly as it relates to political equality. They're implemented fairly, not necessarily based upon who you know, so everybody gets treated the same. And then we all obey the law. Just because we can get away with violating the law doesn't mean that we should do it. And so promoting the common good on an individualistic level is basically saying, putting our head down, doing our job, following the rules, not cheating, and letting everybody do the same. The collective notion of the common good is that embraced through either modern liberal, faith-driven, or other communitarian political philosophies. And that basically says we have a direct obligation to making the world a better place. It demands more of the individual, and it demands that the individual sometimes push aside their own personal self-interest if it promotes their long-term self-interest or the good of the community. It's also developmental for us that participation in promoting the common good makes us better people in some way, shape, or form. And then again, laws are important to the collective notion, but these laws should reflect the will of people as expressed in the self-governing decisions made through what we call deliberation. And so that requires an active, engaged citizenry. You see this in the New England town hall model of local government, which can be pretty difficult sometimes because basically it assumes everyone's going to show up, and once you show up, you're supposed to deliberate. It can be seen in other forms as well, but generally speaking, the collective action is not the dominant one in the United States. Hope this has been useful and worth your 20 minutes. Oh, I forgot. There are consistencies and inconsistencies. I want you to look at them. I think they're pretty self-evident. I've broken it down into libertarianism, conservatism, and progressivism or modern liberalism. These are the three major strains, with the second being the Republican tendencies, the third being the Democratic tendencies, and the first being sort of that thing that cuts across parties and is a strong but minor element of the political belief systems of people in the U.S. The third one is most important because it's the topic that you will read about in the last of the books for this course.